Okay, well, I'll do it this way.
So, Richard, um, uh, let's you and I do a little back and forth of interview, and then we're going to open it up to the whole group. And I just I want to ask you if you and I were talking yesterday about the good old days back in the 60s when, unbeknownst to each other, we were both living in the Haight-Ashbury. Um, we were both in our 20s, and it was the year was 67, and it was San Francisco, and it was all sorts of wild and crazy stuff going on that also involved art and also involved spirituality in the ways it was manifesting back then. And you shared something with me about yourself that was really interesting about the way you started approaching people and asking them questions. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, that I'd just graduated from college. I'd come from Southern California up to San Francisco and landed basically right next door to the Haight-Ashbury. I had big ambitions in poetry, and I was on fire with a love of poetry, and I'd been given some strokes back down in Southern California at the college I attended, and supported the idea that I was, a writer who could maybe do something in the world. So I was in San Francisco with a lot of ambition, excitement, but before very long, I began to realize that there were some problems in terms of actually how to do this thing, how to get my poetry into the world. For one thing, it terrified me to go out there and get in front of people in a coffee house and read my poetry. I tried it a few times, but I eventually came to a moment when, sitting at my desk in my little flat, I saw that I was sort of composing very high-minded, deep sorts of writings, but at the same time, I sort of realized that just simply on an ordinary living basis that I really didn't know how to get around in the world and take care of ordinary business affairs, to do the stuff that you needed to do to pay your rent. And I sort of felt a big contradiction between these two parts of myself, the sort of deep, poetic world of my mind, and the ways in which I was really struggling and didn't feel very well equipped to deal with ordinary life. So um, I really felt sort of lost in terms of an ordinary life. And I realized that the world was full of people all around me in San Francisco who seemed to know what they were doing. They seemed to be heading one way or another with a sense of purpose. And I'd gotten a degree in philosophy, and the whole thing about that seemed to be a search for truth. So I considered myself a person who was interested in the truth. And I thought, where do you get the truth? Do you just read books? Or do you actually try to find out the truth for yourself? I thought, if you're serious, you try to find out the truth for yourself. And I thought, well, people seem to know what they're doing. Why don't I just go out there on the streets and into the libraries and start asking people, and maybe they know something about life. Why don't I personally ask people about life and see if they can tell me something, see if I can learn something from actual people around me. So
What an amazing, what an amazing thing. Imagine this guy 50 years ago approaching you and asking you to tell him something about life.
of course, I realized that I was on the edge of. It was a pretty sort of. It would be considered possibly a crazy thing. I realized that I walk up to somebody on the street and say, "Excuse me, sir, um, I'm really searching for some knowledge about how to live. Could you tell me, do you know something about how to live?" I realize that the very first reaction that people would probably have is, "Okay, crazy guy on the street. How am I going to deal with this guy?" So, of course, I preface my approaches to people to try and disarm them. I say, "Excuse me, sir, this probably sounds kind of crazy to you because here I am, a stranger, and I'm approaching you. And what I want to ask you is, you seem to be someone that knows what you're doing, and I don't. I'm not so sure what I'm doing in this world. Can you tell me something about what you know?" So I did that for a while, and I got, I had some interesting encounters doing that. So RA, when we were talking, you were asking me basically about how did I get started with interviewing, and in recent years, it crossed my mind that this was perhaps the beginning back in 1966, 67.
Wow. So let's fast forward when you started talking to artists, so how did that come about?
Well, okay, that's a long story. I'll try to boil it way down. I got involved in photography, and not because I had thought I'd be interested in it. It was sort of an accident. But long story short, I started having experiences of being in the presence of beauty related to what Wendy, what you were saying, just the light. Um, and we tend to think of such things as a small thing, the light falling on a coffee table through our front window, or the light on a windowsill, or the light that lands on our plate at the table. And suddenly I'm touched. Something is touched deep in my feeling. The, but really, if one is able to sort of receive that, um, be open to that in a deep way, that can be a profound experience. And I was having profound experiences along these lines, which I would just call the experience of beauty. So, without having intended to get involved in photography as an art form, I thought, okay, this is art. I've got to, maybe I should make photographs and see if I could get them in a gallery. So, I started to encounter the fashions of the art world, and the art world wasn't interested in beauty. They
Oh,
weren't. They weren't interested in that at all. They were interested in a lot of other things, and I started reading art critical stuff, and I got very, very angry. Actually, I got very pissed off at some of the stuff I was reading because it seemed so unrelated to what seemed to me to be of central importance. And one day I got so angry reading some article in Art Week about what is art. I decided, all right, I'm going to go find out what people think. Regular people, I'll just go start asking people, what is art? Because
ah,
I think whoever's writing this article doesn't have a clue. It's a highly intellectualized sort of vision of art, and all these things have their place. And art is such a huge topic. You can has so many facets, and there's so many ways to look at it. But what was bothering me was essentially the lack of a place for the deep feelings that was not being recognized. So I got a little tape recorder and I started walking around. I went down to the Oakland Museum and I started asking people. I had a little microphone. "Excuse me, ma'am, would you mind answering a question for me? What do you think? What is art for you? What is the meaning of art?" Well, this is an almost impossible question, and I knew that. But I started sort of doing that and asking people, "What is art?"
wow.
and and what I found was that what regular, quote, regular people thought about art corresponded very much to my experience of art. It was the experts who were on some other kind of level about what art was.
What's fascinating is that you're sort of taking that same, I could call it beginner's mind approach, that you had been taking 30 years earlier. and just sort of asking the question in a very open, naive kind of way, and look what came out of it.
Well, yeah, thank you. I mean, what I discovered eventually when it sort of became when all this sort of came into the focus that resulted in me starting a magazine. What I discovered was that talking with artists, we could have a conversation that corresponded very much to my own experience. It wasn't what people were running into in the world of journalism and sort of art journals, where there's something widely described as art speak, and I think that happens in a lot of the academic settings. Artists, I think, especially in the academic world, science is so, well, in the world in general, science and technology rules. So what do you do with these so-called soft sciences, sociology, psychology? All these disciplines have tried to become scientific, and art and creativity in the English departments, the powerful influence of the power of science, and then the French philosophers Derrida, Lyotard, and people like that started to have so much influence, and there was a huge movement in the academic world to try and become respectable and rigorous, and things became very intellectual. So regular folks who didn't have MFAs still thought art had to do with beauty and truth and something deep in the feeling.
Imagine that.
So
yeah. So Richard, since we have a limited time for this part of the interview, what I want to do, you and I had gone over a few different artists and a few different issues, and I was looking back over that this morning, and I selected just a few as a couple of examples. So what I would like to do would be to just visit maybe 2 or 3 of those and ask you some stuff about that, okay?
All right. Okay.
So here's where I want to go now. Let's see. Okay. So let's see, let me get it set up on my screen here. So one of your early issues, you interviewed the famous architect, Paolo Soleri. Can everybody see that on your screen? Yeah, okay. So this was back in 2001. You interviewed the famous architect who in some ways really reshaped a lot of how the world thinks about buildings and architecture and cities. And can you give us, 1 or 2 highlights about what your conversation with Paolo Soleri was like?
Well, it was for me a big deal, very big deal. As you see that photograph there, I took that photo of Soleri at Arco Santi, his place, one of his 2 places in Arizona. As you can see, he's up in years. He had stopped giving interviews at the time I visited Arco Santi. I knew that I'd been told he wouldn't accept an interview, but I went there anyway, and so it was a big thrill just simply for him to agree to be interviewed. But he only said, I can only give you 15 minutes. Well, what did I talk to him about? I'd spent many hours preparing to talk to him, and I'd read 3 of his books. The problem with trying to describe these things is the time we have for it is so short. He has the idea that cities are the essential place that humanity needs to get right in order to survive. The cities, if they are compact enough and dense enough, will create a kind of energy and creativity that will be necessary to have some higher level enter life, like grace. And he also saw very clearly that environmental issues had to be equally important to cities. And so he was way ahead of the curve on the issues of having sort of ecologically sustainable way of life. And he doesn't get credit for this stuff, but for decades, young architects from all over the world would come and visit Arcosanti, and he would talk about things like the environment and the necessary sort of concern about um, a sustainable use of energy, the sustainability of how we dealt with our land, and the way to build cities with mixed use sort of planning that would sort of vivify life and bring us to life in a way that could hopefully help us survive as we move forward. So it's hard to say what, R.A., I know I'm rambling on because I can't help it. There's so much content in this stuff. It's sort of impossible to pick out one thing.
Yeah, no, this is good, and maybe later when we, in the After Hours Club, we can sort of delve a little deeper into some of these. So thank you, Richard, for humoring me and sort of going with just a quick take on some of these things. Let's see if I can, my screen isn't letting me do what I want to do here. Okay, here's another person. Here's Joan DeStefano, who worked with stained glass. Can you tell us a little bit about this encounter, what that was like?
Well, this is a great story. I was at an open house with my magazine spread out on a table, and there were a bunch of different sort of artists and all kinds of people walking around, and this woman walked up to me and handed me a little postcard and said, "You should do a story on me." Well, this happens to me,
No, do a story on me.
So, I sort of cringe inwardly. It's like, oh God, but I don't like to hurt people's feelings. So I looked at her little card and it was not interesting, but I said, okay, why don't you sit down here next to me? Oh, tell me what it is. Why should I do a story on you? And I'm glad that I asked her to sit down and tell me why I should do a story. Yeah, there's Joan. I soon learned that she'd worked in North Beach in topless bars to put herself through the Art Institute. And then she said, one day I took my motorcycle and drove it up to Seattle to this glass thing. I said, wait a minute, you motorcycle? What kind of motorcycle? Harleys. I had Harleys. So here's this little woman, and she drives motorcycles. She worked in topless bars. And then she told me that she had gone to a conference in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky. And she told me she had been a reader of Thomas Merton when she was a teenager working in Macy's. She's clearly from a blue-collar background. She's Sicilian, sort of a Sicilian, Italian, Jewish person who talked like she's sort of
Italian Jewish, excuse me.
Really, I mean, I'm telling you, and she had a kind of way about her that you could just imagine she would be very comfortable with a mafia family, and but she was reading Thomas Merton, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this person is, I'm the best person she could possibly have sat down next to tell her story. And after about 5 minutes, I said, yeah, I knew I wanted to do a story on her. So she ended up at the Abbey Gethsemane. And anyway, it's a long, long story. This is an example for me of how one's judgments, you have to be careful about your judgments, because when I saw her walking up to the table, I had this judgment that here's another person that wants something, and I'm not going to, she isn't going to be very interesting. That was my judgment. And nothing could have been further from the truth. Fortunately, another part of me said, sit down here and let's hear what it is that is interesting about you. And so it's an incredible story. She really, it's truly amazing.
So thank you. And again, you sounds like you decided to stay with your beginner's mind approach with her. Okay, now here's
Fortunately.
somebody who shows up in in one of your issues, and I'm particularly interested in this because this not only was an article, but it also changed your whole business model. Can you tell us this story about how you connected with Nipun?
Yeah, I'd been doing the magazine. I'd never made a dime. I started out without a business plan. The whole thing started sort of one day, from one day to the next. I started a magazine. That's a long story, but I had no business plan. Um, but at the beginning, I started thinking I was supposed to do various things, carry advertising, blah blah blah, and it took me a few years to realize that none of that was any good. It was a soul sucking exercise. It was using up my energy. It wasn't getting me anywhere. And finally, I just said, I'm going to forget everything except trying to do the best I can and focus on high quality work. So I'd been doing this for 15 years. I'd long ago given up on, quote, making money. It had never been part of my idea anyway. So one day I got an email from a guy, a stranger. Can you send me a certain issue? You interviewed a friend of mine. Turned out to be Paul Van Slambrook. Have you met him, RA?
I think I have, yeah.
Paul was, he said, Paul, I didn't know who he was, but he had been he'd been the Christian Science stringer in San Francisco, and then he became the editor in chief of the Christian Science Monitor. Anyway, he had retired, and when I'd sent him this magazine, he sent me back a note saying, I love what you're doing, and I'd like to volunteer to help you. So I accepted his offer, and he'd moved back to San Francisco from Boston. I started hearing stories about this guy, this young man named Nipun Mehta from Paul. Paul broke the first big story about Nipun shortly after Nipun had got Charity Focus going back in 1999. Well, after about 3 or 4 stories from Paul about Nipun, I said, hey, Paul, God, I'd love to meet this guy. I'm sure I'd like to interview him. So he set up a lunch for the three of us in a taqueria at Berkeley. And we're sitting there. It's a Sunday at around noon, and we're just hitting it off famously, the three of us. And about 20 minutes into our burritos, Nipun leans across the table and he says, hey, Richard, how can I serve you? Well, no one had asked me that. Probably no one's asked any of you that question, right? Who asked that? How can I serve you? I just laughed and said, I don't know, Nipun, and that's beautiful. Sort of, thinking we can move on, I hope, because I don't have an answer for that. But instead of moving on, he's just looking at me and there's a silence. And he says, I'm serious, Richard. What do you want? So long story short, Nipun ambushed me. I didn't I didn't sort of catch him for an interview. He threw this challenge down in front of me. He said, I told him what I wanted in a very modest but sincere way. And he said, this is what he said. Nipun tells the story slightly differently. I maintain that mine is the correct version.
Of
They're
course.
related. They're related, but he says, what you're doing, Richard, is a gift. And if you're willing to give it away, I'll help you. He threw that down on the table in front of me. I mean, who could be prepared for something like that? I'd been doing the magazine for 15 years. I knew I wasn't making money. Now he wants this young guy who I just met. I'd known this guy for 20 minutes. He says if I'm willing to give away my magazine, he'll help me. Well, I know that Nipun doesn't know anything about the art world. I mean, how do I know that? My intuition is very good. The art world's a weird place. I mean, regular people, I think, have a good idea about art, but the art world is a very kind of many-sided place. If I will give my magazine away, he'll help me. So I said, okay, Nipun. I thought, all right, I'm almost giving it away anyway. How big of a jump is this? So that's how I met Nipun. And the next day we got together and talked for 2 hours, and it's and sort of that's how it started 11 years ago with Nipun.
Wow. Yeah. Um, amazing stories, each one.